The alarm that woke Lyrenvath was not the one she had been promised. The wake cycle was supposed to begin with the low three-tone chime of a scheduled rotation, her mother's recorded voice reading the watch assignments, and the slow, warm flood of revival fluid timed to a navigator's gentle schedule. Instead, she came up through the cold with a klaxon hammering against the inside of her skull, red light strobing through the frosted lid of her pod, and a mechanical voice repeating, without inflection, the two worst words in the HFY spacefaring lexicon: stasis fault. Her pod lid released a half-second before the emergency bolts would have blown it. She rolled out onto the grating of the sleep gallery, lungs burning, limbs answering late, and the first thing she saw through the swimming dark was the status board that ran the length of the chamber. 38 tiles, one for each soul aboard the Sinshara. On the day she had gone under, every tile had burned a steady gold. Now 9 of them were amber, 4 were flickering, and 6 were black. She did not understand the black tiles yet. Her body understood before her mind did. She was shaking and not from the cold. She hauled herself up the rail, found the gallery clock, and read the elapsed time figure that the ship had been faithfully keeping while everyone aboard slept. The run from Ashvar to Earth had been planned at 80 years. The clock read 799 years, 11 months, and a string of days her eyes refused to finish. Liren read it 3 times. Then she did the thing old Koro had drilled into her since she was 9 years old. The thing he said separated a navigator from a passenger who happened to sit near the charts. She refused to believe a single instrument. She crossed the gallery on legs that barely held her, pulled the manual release on the observation shutter, and looked at the sky. The stars were wrong. Not slightly wrong, not parallax wrong, not we drifted off the line wrong. The hooks of Veshan, the constellation she had been born under, the one her mother had pointed out through this same port when she was 4 years old, had come apart. Its anchor stars had crawled away from one another the way stars only crawl across centuries. The plow had lost its blade. The long swimmer had folded in half. 800 years of proper motion was written across the black, and no instrument fault in the history of any fleet had ever rewritten the sky itself. The clock was telling the truth. They had not slept 80 years on the long glide into Sol. They had slept 10 lifetimes. Behind her, other pods were opening. She heard Shipmistress Drenkavet's voice before she saw her, hoarse from 8 centuries of silence and already giving orders, because that was what Dren was for. She heard the engineer Suthaorm swearing softly and steadily at the amber tiles. And she heard the sound she would not be able to forget afterward, the sound of the ship's physician, Pelin Moore, sliding open the first of the black tile pods and going completely quiet. Liren made herself walk to the board. She made herself read the names under the black tiles, because a navigator does not look away from a reading. The third name was Koro Eth. Old Koro, master pilot of the Sinshara, the man who had set her infant hand on a star chart the day she was certified at 19 and told the assembled crew that the ship had 2 navigators now and the young one had better instincts. His pod had failed in the 406th year of the long dark. He had died in his sleep, alone in a sleeping ship, 394 years ago, and the ship had logged it and kept gliding because there was no one awake to mourn him. Pelin was moving down the line of black pods, pausing at each one. Nobody said the count out loud. Nobody ever would, the whole rest of the voyage. It was not a number, it was 6 faces, and the crew of the Sinshara carried them as faces. Her father found her at the board. Arlvath, hull warden, a wide, flat-shouldered man built like the airlock doors he maintained, still gray-lipped from revival, and he did the only thing that could be done in front of that wall. He put his hand on the back of his daughter's neck, the way Ashvaran fathers do at gravesides, and they stood there for the length of 3 breaths, which was all the time the ship could spare them. Your mother's tile, he said. Amber, Liren said, holding, Veravath, signal keeper, slept on in the 17th pod with her vital traces sagging at the edge of the safe band. Amber meant the pod was failing slowly instead of quickly. Amber meant, do not wake her without a medical bay running at full power or the wake itself will kill her. Amber meant her mother was a hostage of the ship's dwindling reserves, and so were 22 others, because 800 years had eaten margins that had been engineered for 80. Shipmistress Dren called the conscious crew to the chart room within the hour. There were 8 of them on their feet. Dren, Liren, her father, Sutha the engineer, Pelin the physician, the lore master Dovin Ree, the comms officer Imosah, and a junior systems hand named Akit, whose pod had simply been luckier than his bunkmates. 8 awake, 23 asleep and unwakeable without help, dead, one ship 8 centuries off its life. Dren did not waste a word on disbelief. She had been ship mistress for 40 years before the ship had ever sailed, and she ran the meeting the way she would have run a hull breach. Sutha, power. The keel reactor is alive and dying, Sutha said. Fuel salts decayed. We slept on the maintenance trickle. And the trickle is why anyone slept at all. At current draw with the pods on full support, I can promise 40 days. I can stretch to 60 if the 8 of us live cold and dark. I cannot promise 70. Drive. The fold core is slag. It has been slag for 800 years. The misfire that threw us is the misfire that killed it. Trim thrusters are healthy. We can steer. We cannot stop. Not really. And we cannot go anywhere the arc isn't already taking us. And where's the arc taking us? Dren asked, and looked at Lyran. And the whole room looked at Lyran, and she understood that this was now her ship to find a road for, because the other navigator's tile was black. She put the plot on the table display with hands she kept steady by force. The misfire threw us long, she said. The gatefold was supposed to put us out at the rim of Sol's far approaches for a 50-year glide in. Instead, it spat us into a ballistic arc through the deep dark. The arc is closed. It always was. We have spent 800 years falling around the long way to exactly where we were going. She moved the plot, and the line of their fall bent inward, down through the marker line, down through the outer system, down toward a small yellow star. We are inside Sol's outermost wake line now. That is what triggered revival. The wake clock was slave to Sol proximity, not elapsed time. The ship never knew it was late. It only knew it had finally arrived. Then we are where we meant to be, Dovenry said quietly. 800 years after we meant to be there. 40 days of power, Dren said. 23 sleepers we cannot wake without a harbor support. The nearest harbor is the one we were sent to. So we go down the well. We raise the Twin Shore Compact's marker line we call Earth, and Earth brings us in. They kept harbor for our grandparents' treaty ships. They will keep harbor for us. She said it like an order to the universe. Then she said, Amel, raise the waypost. Amelsa bent over the comms board, and that was the moment the second wrongness of the day arrived. The one that would sit in Lyran's chest for every day that followed. The marker line was silent. The wayposts were the Compact's own children. A string of beacon buoys laid down the approach corridor in the treaty years, sung into place by Ashvarin's survey crews and human tender ships working side by side. Lyran had grown up on the recordings. Every Ashvarin child of the Sinshara had. Each waypost carried both voices, a human voice and an Ashvarin voice, repeating the corridor designations and the welcome formula on the hour, every hour forever. The hailing protocol was the first thing she had ever memorized that wasn't a lullaby. You came up the corridor and the waypost talked you in, and the recordings her mother kept said the sound of them was like being walked home by friends in the dark. Imel swept every compact band, then every emergency band, then every band the receiver could physically hear. Nothing. Not static. Static would have been something. A clean, structured, total silence. Across the entire spectrum the corridor had once filled with voices. 800 years ago, this stretch of space had been the loudest place in 2 civilizations. Now it was the quietest thing Lyran had ever pointed an antenna at. Beacons die, Sutha said without conviction. 8 centuries, power systems fail. All of them? Imel said. 41 buoys on this corridor alone, built to a 100-year service life, maintained on a 20-year cycle. 1 fails, 5 fail. A war takes a stretch of them. Not all. Never all, Dovenry said what nobody else would. He was the oldest of them now that Koro was gone, the ship's lore master, the only soul aboard who had actually stood on Earth. He had been a young records clerk at the Lowbank Embassy in the last years before the Sinshara sailed, and he had spent the voyage out teaching Earth to a ship full of people who would never have believed how much he missed it. 800 years, Doven said, is longer than most civilizations get. No one answered him. Dren ordered the ship dark and cold, all power to the pods, and they fell down the silent corridor toward the first waypost on the line, because it was on their way to everything else, and because a navigator confirms a reading before she believes it. It took 6 days to reach the buoy, 6 days of cold rations and colder bulkheads, of Pellin nursing the amber pods like a man keeping coals alive in the rain, of her father walking the hull seams, because a warden walks his rounds, whatever the century. Lyran spent the days at the charts, replotting an approach to Sol with 800-year-old ephemeris tables, correcting planet positions by hand the way Koro had taught her, and not thinking about the fact that every correction was also a count of everything that had died while she slept. On the 3rd day, Imel began transmitting on the compact hailing bands the full protocol, the Sinshara's registry, their distress particulars, the formal request for harbor. The message went out ahead of them at the speed of light, down the corridor, toward Earth. Nothing came back. Day after day, nothing came back. On the 6th day, Waypost 19 came up on the forward scope, and the wrongness changed shape. Lyran had expected a corpse. A dead buoy after 8 centuries should be a tumbling lump of scorched alloy, solar-bleached, micrometeorite pitted, antennas snapped to stubs, paint flayed to bare metal by the slow sandblast of the dark. Every derelict in every training archive looked like that. Dead things in space wear their death. Waypost 19 was clean. It hung exactly on station, to the meter, on a corridor coordinate 800 years old. Its hull was whole. Its panels were bright. Its long hailing array, the one that should have been singing the welcome formula on the hour every hour, was intact, aligned, and as silent as the bottom of a grave. Sutha put the scope's full magnification on it, and her breath went out of her slow. "That buoy has been serviced," she said. "Recently, there's no pitting. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Space pits everything. The dark fills everything with little holes. It never stops. It's the one thing you can count on, and that hull is smooth. Someone wipes the dark off that beacon. Someone keeps it on station. Someone replaced that array, and the alloy is a weave I don't even recognize." And then she stopped. "Then they switched it off," Imel said. The chart room was quiet for a long time. "Dead worlds don't polish their tombstones," Dren said at last. "Something is alive in this system. Something tends the compact line. And that something heard our hail 6 days ago and chose silence." She looked around the room. And for the first time since waking, the ship mistress of the Sinshara looked like a woman feeling for a handhold in the dark. "I want a theory. Anyone. I'll take a bad one." "Salvagers," Sutha said. "Some third species moved in after whatever happened. They keep the buoys as navigation marks for themselves and keep them quiet to stay hidden." "Quarantine," Imel said. "Plague, war. Something that made the system seal itself. The silence is a warning we're too old to read." "Or there was a war," Liren's father said, "and the side that won was not the side that built the beacons, and it keeps them as trophies." Dovin Ree stood at the port with his hands folded, looking at the bright, mute, faithful buoy, and said nothing at all. Liren watched him instead of the beacon. The lore master had spent 8 days telling them all, in 100 ways, that Earth was the most stubborn thing he had ever loved. She could see him fitting each theory against the people he remembered, and she could see that none of them fit, and that what frightened him was not that humanity might be gone. It was that he could not make the pieces say anything at all. She ran the numbers that night because numbers were what she had. The maintenance interval on the buoy, from the micrometeorite flux Sutha, measured against the hull's cleanliness. Someone had tended waypost 19 within the last 4 years. The silence on the bands, total, structured, deliberate. The lack of any reply to 6 days of distress hailing, a choice. She wrote it in the navigator's log the way Koro would have demanded, observations first, conclusions never ahead of their data, and the entry came out reading like a riddle. "The road to Earth is swept and lit by no one. The lights are off and the lamps are clean. Whatever keeps this corridor does not answer the corridor's own protocol." And then, because the log was private and she was 21 years old and 800 years from both of her worlds, she wrote one more line. "Everyone who ever waited for this ship is dead. We are coming home to people who have never heard our names." She sealed the log and did not cry, and the Sanshara fell onward, down the clean, dark road, toward the station that the charts said should be next on the line. It was called Cairn Deep on the compact charts, a human deep-range station on the inner rim of Sol's far belt, the corridor's first true harbor stop. Dovin had been there. He talked about it on the long approach, in the cold chart room with everyone wrapped in thermal quilts, because Dren had quietly ordered him to keep talking on the bad days. The lore master's stories were the only heat the ship could afford. He told them about a station that smelled of coffee and hydraulic fluid, about human dock crews who had learned HFY and courtesy so badly and so earnestly that the embassy had finally made up a new etiquette that split the difference, about a station master who kept a wall of pennants from every ship that had ever docked there, every ship of either species, and how the Sinshara's pennant had been raised on that wall on the outbound run with a toast in 2 languages. "It will be a ruin," he said at the end to the quilts in the cold. "I know that. I am telling you what it was so that when we see the ruin, somebody aboard knows the difference." On the 11th day, Cairn Deep rose on the scope, and it was not a ruin, and the difference was worse. The station hung in its old orbit like a museum exhibit of itself. 800 years should have left it tumbling, breached, bled out. Instead, it sat trim and station-kept, hull seams bright, radiators folded in the formal stowed position that human dock crews called putting the station to bed. Its windows were dark. Its docking guidance, the cheerful strobing ladder of lights Dovin had described, was off. Its traffic antennae were not broken. They were furled deliberately the way a flag is furled. And across the face of its main docking bay, in letters of inlaid alloy 10 meters tall, in flawless formal Ashvaran script alongside the human characters, someone had written a single sentence. Dovin read it aloud through the scope, and his voice cracked in the middle. "This station kept the door for 212 years. The door is now kept closer in." "Closer in," Dren repeated. "Closer in to what?" to Sol, Liren said. "It's a corridor marker. It's telling traffic the harbor moved down the well." She stared at the letters until they blurred. "It's written in our script, ship mistress. 800 years, and whoever wrote that still letters in high formal Ashvaran. The grammar is old-fashioned. It's the grammar Dovin taught us. It's compact-era grammar, kept like the buoys are kept. It's a tombstone, Imel said quietly. A polite one, maybe the politest tombstone ever cut. It doesn't change the facts. Dark windows, furled arrays, no answer on any band. Whoever cut those letters cut them a long time ago. Dren took the ship in anyway. They had no choice and everyone knew it. The reactor was 30 days from silence, and a station that intact might hold fuel salts, and 23 sleepers were worth any risk the dark could invent. The Sanshara's docking probe touched the bay's guide rail, and Cairn Deep woke up. Not all of it, not like a living station. But the moment the probe's compact standard handshake brushed the rail, the bay lights rose, soft and unhurried, to exactly the warmth and intensity specified in the Twin Shore Compact's joint docking annex, a number Lyran knew because she had memorized the annexes as a girl the way other children memorize songs. The rail accepted the probe. The bay pressurized itself on a schedule old enough to be scripture, and a tone sounded in the bay, 3 notes, and Dovin sat down very slowly on the deck of the chart room, because it was the harbor chime of the compact era, the one that meant in 2 languages at once. You are safe now, you are at rest, the watch is ours. They went aboard armed, her father first. They found no one. They found something stranger than no one. The station had been emptied the way a house is closed up for a season, not the way a world dies. Every cabin was bare, swept, and sealed. Every tool was racked. The station master's wall of penance had been carefully taken down, all but 1 row left in place under a transparent seal, the row of Ashvaran ships. 11 pennants, 11 treaty ships of the old joint survey fleets, preserved under crystal with a small formal card in both scripts that read, simply awaited. The Sanshara's pennant was the 4th from the left. Lyran stood in front of it for a long time. The pennant her crew had raised with a toast 800 years ago hung clean and bright in a sealed case aboard an empty station, labeled in a dead grammar with the 1 word in either language that could not be read as past tense, not remembered, not honored, awaited. Ship mistress, Sutha called over the suit channel from 3 decks down, and her voice had a strange shake in it. The fuel stores. You need to see the fuel stores. The deep bunkers of Cairn Deep held fuel salts in compact standard cradles, fresh stabilized current. Sutha's assay put their synthesis inside the last decade. Beside the Ashvaran standard cradles stood racks of stores in formats Sutha did not recognize, 11 different formats labeled in scripts that belonged to no species either of their worlds had ever met. The bunker manifest terminal lit at a touch, in formal Ashvaran, and offered them the station's entire inventory under a single standing order. It displayed without being asked, an order with an authorization stamp 8 centuries old and a renewal stamp from within the year. Provision any vessel that asks. The cost is met. There are 11 kinds of stranger here, Sutha said, while the loading cranes woke around her and began, gently, without one further word of permission, to fuel the Sanshara. 11 fuel formats. 11 atmospheres mixed in the hospitality tanks. I checked, one of them is ours, the exact blend, trace gases and all. This is not a tomb, and it is not a salvage post, and whoever stocked it is expecting guests from 12 directions at once. She paused, and nobody is home. The galley is stocked and cold. The bunks are made and empty. The kindness is running on rails with no one inside it. Shipmistress, with respect, this is the loneliest place I have ever stood. That was the night the crew's grief found its shape in the wardroom of a borrowed station, around the first hot meal in 800 years. It was Amel who finally said it. They automated their goodness, and then they died of something. That's the story. You can see it from here. The plague comes, or the war, or the long, slow sunset, and a people like the ones Dovin describes, a people who letter their tombstones in their friend's grammar, they spend the end making sure the lights would come on for anyone who ever knocked. The stations keep the door because the doorkeepers are gone. We're being hosted by a will. We're eating a dead family's funeral bread. Dovin turned his cup in his hands. He was quiet so long that the hum of the station filled the room. I knew them, he said at last. You all know them as the compact, as the annexes, as the other signature on the charts. I knew them as dock crews who learned our funerals, so no Ashvaran spacer would ever be sung into the dark in one voice. I sat in a low-bank tavern while a human woman a hand shorter than Lyran argued our own etiquette against me, and won. They were loud, they were young, they were in such a hurry it made your teeth ache, and they kept things. That was the strangeness of them no briefing ever captured. They were the youngest species on the corridor, and they kept things like the oldest. Promises, grudges, names, mostly names. He set the cup down. If they are dead, then the universe is poorer than I have the strength to think about tonight. But I will tell you what I cannot make sit still in my head. Imel, you said it yourself. The kindness is running on rails. Rails rust. Automation drifts. 800 years of unattended systems do not stay this clean, this current, this exact. Sutha says the fuel was synthesized within the decade. The buoy was wiped within 4 years. The renewal stamp on that standing order is from this year. He looked around the table. The dead do not renew their promises annually. Something in this system is not running on rails. Something is keeping house. And it will not speak to us, and I do not know why, and that is the only thing in 800 years of catastrophe that I cannot find one single precedent for. Liren said, then we keep going until something explains itself. She had not meant to speak. The words came out in Koro's cadence, a navigator's cadence, and she saw Dren glance at her with something that was almost a smile. The message on the bay said the door is kept closer in. Fine, we're invited closer in. The Ark agrees, the fuel agrees, the sleepers don't have another option, and neither do we. I can have a burn plotted by morning that takes the corridor straight down the well. Inner system in 19 days. She looked at the sealed case down the corridor at the 4th pennant. Somebody wrote awaited on our name. I want to meet them, or I want to stand on whatever is left of them. Either way, the answer is sunward. The answer is sunward, Dren agreed. Burn at your discretion, navigator. They nearly lost a sleeper at Cairn Deep on the last night of the fueling stay. It was Pod 9. A hydroponics hand named Esavel, who had joined the crew at 19 and gone under at 22, and her support lattice chose that night to drop out of amber and begin the quick slide that the black tiles had taught them all to dread. Pellin was at the gallery inside of 2 minutes, stripping power from the galley and the heating loops with both hands. Sutha was 3 minutes behind him, hauling a cable run from the station umbilicals. And for half an hour, the pod gallery of the Sanshara was the only loud place in 100 million kilometers. The physician calling draws intolerances, the engineer feeding him a dead station strength, the tile on the board flickering between amber and the color nobody named. It was the station that ended it. 29 minutes into the fight, without being asked, without a word, Cairn Deep changed its power feed. The umbilical voltage steadied. The delivery curve shifted into a profile Sutha had not requested and immediately recognized, because it was the compact annex revival support standard, the precise wave a failing Ashvaran pod wants, served from human hardware that had no operational reason to remember it, and Pod 9 drank it and came back from the edge and settled into a steadier amber than it had held since the wake. Pellin stood with his hands still raised over the console for a long moment, like a man whose opponent had suddenly stood aside, and then he laughed once badly and sat down on the deck plates where he was. Noted for the log, he said to no one in particular. Patient stabilized. Attending physician, this physician, the engineer, and a dead man's house. Liren wrote it in the navigator's log herself, because Koro would have demanded it go somewhere more rigorous than a physician's relieved blasphemy. Station power anticipated compact revival standard without request. The annex profiles are not stored in our umbilical handshake. It knew the standard. Conclusion withheld. She looked at the line for a while, and then she walked the empty corridor to the station master's deck, alone, and stood in front of the sealed crystal case with the 11 pennants and the 4th from the left, and the single word in the dead grammar. If anyone is reading the umbilical logs, she said aloud to the empty, bright, listening station, feeling foolish and doing it anyway, her name is Essa. She plants things. You just bought her whatever the rest of this road costs. And whoever you are, wherever you went, the Sanshara is keeping account of what it owes this house. Her voice cracked on the old formal thanks phrase, the one for hospitality that cannot be repaid. And she said it anyway, all of it in the grammar the station's letters were cut in. The lights of the station master's deck did not change. The case did not move. But the next morning, when they walked the boarding tube for the last time, the manifest terminal at the airlock was lit before they reached it, and it had added one line beneath the standing order, informal Ashvaran, where no line had been the day before. The cost is met. The account is closed. Go gently, 39. Imel stared at it the whole time it took the lock to cycle. 39, he said, not 32. It counted the manifest, not the living. He looked back down the bright empty corridor. Whatever keeps this house, it keeps the dead on the rolls. They cast off from Cairn Deep with full bunkers and a strange heavy tenderness, like guests leaving a house whose owners had stepped out moments before arriving forever. As the station fell astern, its bay lights dimmed themselves back down to dark on the same unhurried schedule, putting itself back to bed, and Imel, watching it go, transmitted the old compact thanks for harbor signal out of pure reflex. The station did not answer. But far out on the corridor line for exactly 1 second, Waypost 19's long-dead hailing array lit with a single pulse of carrier wave, no message, no voice, just one clean watt of acknowledgement, and went silent again. They argued about that 1 watt for 19 days. It was on the 8th day of the burn that the corridor stopped pretending it was empty. Liren had the watch. The board was quiet, the burn was steady, and the forward sweep was returning the same nothing it had returned for a week, when the collision warning array woke up screaming with a contact 11 minutes ahead. A shoal of debris, cold and dark and dense, square across the corridor line. Old wreckage by its signature, a smashed hull or a dead structure ground to fragments centuries ago, tumbling along an orbit that crossed theirs almost exactly. With fold drive, it would have been a footnote. With trim thrusters and a ship too fragile for hard maneuvering, and 23 sleepers who could not survive an emergency burn, it was arithmetic with no good answer, and Liren ran the arithmetic 4 times in 90 seconds and got the same answer 4 times. Wake the shipmistress, she told Ockett very calmly, and laid in the least terrible option, a slow skewing burn that would trade a hull graze for a field graze, and her hands were on the controls when the readings changed. The shoal moved. Not scattered, not drifted. Moved. Across 4,000 kilometers of dark in the 11 minutes the Sinshara needed to be saved, something took hold of a centuries-old wreck field the way a hand takes hold of spilled beads, and gathered it, gently out of the corridor. The fragments did not accelerate outward in any pattern debris obeys. They decelerated in concert, swung wide in a smooth, coordinated arc, and parked themselves in a tidy, stable cluster 40,000 kilometers off the lane. And as the Sinshara swept past 11 minutes later, untouched, every instrument she had recorded the same thing. Nothing, no tug fields, no drive flares, no carrier waves. The dark had simply rearranged itself around their safety, and declined to be seen doing it. Dren arrived on the bridge in time to watch the cluster fall astern. She studied the replay 3 times in silence. That, she said at last, is the second time this system has acted for us. Fuel at the station, now this. It shepherds us, and it will not speak to us. Navigator, I have been in space 60 years, and I have no model for a power that behaves this way. Hostiles don't help. Traitors don't hide. Even mourners speak. She shook her head slowly at the screen. What is it waiting for? Maybe permission, Dovin said, from the hatchway. The alarm had woken half the wake watch, and the lore master stood wrapped in his thermal quilt, looking at the tidy, impossible cluster of saved death on the replay. That's the only shape I can fit to it. Everything down this corridor acts like he hunted for the word, and visibly could not find a precedent for it, and settled, troubled, on the nearest one. Like a servant in a house where the family hasn't come down yet. It feeds the fire. It clears the path. It does not speak first. I know how it sounds, but I have read every record of every contact either of our species ever made, and there is nothing in any archive that waits like this thing waits. Nobody slept well after that. It was not fear, exactly. A power that gathered wreckage out of their road, wished them anything but harm, and every soul aboard knew it. It was the weight of being attended. The Sinshara fell down the dark with a certain knowledge that something vast was keeping pace alongside, holding doors and clearing stones, watching them with what they could no longer pretend was anything but absolute attention, and saying nothing, and the silence that had felt like death at the marker line now felt like held breath. And no one aboard could say which was worse to fall through. On the 11th night, Liren found her father at the aft gallery port, out of his rounds for the first time she could remember, watching the corridor astern. You should be asleep, he said. So should you, he grunted, which from Arlvath was concession, and they stood watching the dark together, the way they had stood at the board on the first day. Somewhere behind them, invisible, a shoal of gathered wreckage held its new station. Somewhere ahead, a fueled road ran down to a silent sun. Your mother used to say the corridor had 2 kinds of dark, he said finally. The dark where nobody is, and the dark where somebody isn't. She worked the signals. She knew the difference by feel. Empty dark is just empty. The other kind has a shape pressed into it, like a chair still warm. He nodded astern at the saved death at the swept road. 800 years I slept, and I woke up grieving in the first kind. Standing here, I'll tell you what's bothering me worse than anything since the black tiles. I don't think we're in the first kind. I think we are falling through the warmest dark anybody ever flew, and I think it knows our names, and I cannot tell my own crew why a thing that knows our names won't say them. His jaw worked. I keep my doors. It's what I'm for. A door you maintain and never open, that's normal, that's readiness. But a voice you maintain and never use, daughter, what is anybody keeping a voice for? Liren had no answer on the 11th night. She would think of that conversation for the rest of her life, every time she remembered the answer arriving, 20 days later, shaking, on a 900-year-old transmitter for you. They were keeping it for you. The inner system killed the argument because the inner system was impossible. It announced itself first as an error. 4 days out from the belt, Liren's sun sights began returning luminosity values for Sol that ran a fraction of a percent low, consistently on every instrument. She assumed instrument drift, 800-year-old optics, and corrected for it until the day the forward scope resolved the cause and then she sat very still at her station for a quarter of an hour and forgot to log anything at all. There was a structure around the sun. Not a wall, not a shell, nothing so crude. A lattice. A weave of filaments and panels so vast and so fine that at first the eye refused it, the way the eye refuses to see a spider's web until the light catches it. It arced around Sol in an unfinished lacework, petals and meridians of gossamer engineering wider than worlds, drinking a measured sip of the star's whole output, and it was visibly, actively growing. At the highest magnification, along the trailing edges of the lace, she could watch construction swarms glittering like dust in a sunbeam. If every mote of the dust had been the size of a city, and the sunbeam had been the property of someone who owned the sun. Dovin came to the scope when she called him. He looked for a long time. The compact era's grandest engine, he said finally, was a fusion yard at the second planet's trailing point. It could build 4 hulls a year, and humans took guests there the way you'd show off a firstborn. I used to think it was the largest thing Pride could build. He stepped back from the eyepiece. They are weaving baskets out of their star, navigator. Whoever they are now, Liren repeated slowly. You no longer think they died. I think, Dovin said, that I have been mourning in the wrong direction. I sat in that wardroom and grieved a young species cut down before it finished growing. Look at that and tell me, child, does the sky over Sol look to you like something that stopped growing? His face in the scope light was not joyful. It was shaken in a way the black tiles had not shaken him. We slept 800 years, Liren. We have been thinking of that as our tragedy, our time lost, our world gone gray without us. We never once turned the arithmetic around. 800 years is how long they have had. We mourned them, and meanwhile they became... He gestured at the scope, and the gesture failed, and he laughed once helplessly, an old man's laugh with grief and awe in it at once. We are a funeral procession arriving at a coronation, but even the lace did not speak. That was what kept the crew's grief alive, long past the point where the evidence had turned strange. Nothing spoke. The Senshara fell down through the inner system, transmitting on every band the corridor had ever used. The registry, the distress particulars, the old hailing songs, even on Dovin's suggestion, plain unencrypted speech. Imo reading the crew manifest aloud into the dark like a man calling names into a canyon, and around them the system moved. Now that they knew how to look, they could see it everywhere. Drive flares too distant to resolve. Traffic lanes betrayed by the faint heat rivers of thousands of hulls. Habitats strung through the belt like beads of mercury. The second planet wrapped in green and girdled with rings of light. Structures at every stable point of every orbit. A civilization at a volume and energy that made the compact era look like a campfire on a beach. Tens of billions of lives, maybe hundreds of billions, conducting themselves across the whole bowl of the system in perfect, deafening, total silence on every frequency the Senshara could hear. It isn't that nobody's home, Imo said on the worst night. I could live with nobody. They're all home. Every light in the house is burning, and we're standing on the porch screaming ourselves hoarse, and not one of them will come to the door. He pushed the transmit log away. I grew up on the recordings. Earth never shut up. 40,000 radio stations, Dovin says. They sang to their probes. They sang to us before they knew we existed. A species that noisy doesn't go quiet in 800 years. Going quiet like this isn't drift. It's doctrine. They heard us at the wayposts. They heard us at Cairn Deep. They hear us right now. And they have a rule about not answering, and I cannot think of one rule like that that means us well. Liren could not sleep that night. She took the watch she didn't have to take, alone in the chart room with the system spread out before her in false color heat and light, all those uncountable silent hearths and her mother's amber tile 2 decks below, and she did what she had been trained to do with a reading that would not resolve. She stripped her assumptions one at a time. Assumption. Silence is absence. Disproven at the wayposts, the silent buoys were tended. Assumption. Silence is hostility. Unsupported. The corridor had fueled them, sheltered them, pressurized a bay to compact standard, and chimed them safe in 2 languages. Hostile powers do not maintain their enemy's grammar for 800 years. Assumption. Silence is indifference. Disproven by 1 clean watt of carrier wave from a beacon that had no operational reason to acknowledge anything, and by a sealed crystal case around 11 pennants, and by 1 word, awaited. She sat with what was left when those 3 were gone, and what was left made no sense. And she wrote it in the log anyway, because Koro had taught her that the readings you cannot make sense of are the only ones worth writing down. They are not absent, hostile, or indifferent. The silence is aimed. It is kept the way the beacons are kept, deliberately at cost, on a renewal schedule. They are being quiet at us, toward us, the way you are quiet in a sick room, the way you are quiet at a graveside, the way you are quiet when you are listening with everything you have for one particular sound, and you do not dare drown it out. She read the last line back, and her hands went cold, and for the first time in 26 days, the readings resolved. She was still awake, running the numbers again and again, when the Senshara's long fall finally brought them inside the orbit of the fourth planet, and the forward scope, sweeping the approach to Earth itself, found the place where the moon relay used to be, and the thing that was parked there now. Relay Salas, the charts called it, the human name rendered into Ashvaran syllables. The great joint communication station of the compact era, anchored on the near face of Earth's moon, the place where every message between two worlds had been gathered, translated, blessed by clerks of both species, and sent on its 30-year crawl across the dark. Dovin had served its low-bank ground terminal. He called it the busiest place humanity owned. It was gone. The crater field where it had stood lay empty even of ruins, the regolith smoothed and faded by centuries. Whatever had been removed cleanly long ago with care. In its place, holding station above the moon's gray shoulder in an orbit so stable it might have been bolted to the sky, hung a ring. The scope gave them the numbers, and the numbers refused to mean anything. 900 kilometers across. A torus of pale, seamless material the color of bone and pearl, turning with a slowness that read less like rotation than like patience, its inner face cut with vast recesses, whose geometry Lyran's instruments kept trying and failing to classify until Sutha, looking over her shoulder, said the word that ended the failing. Berths, she said. Those are berths, navigator. That's not a station. That's a harbor. A harbor built for giants. The smallest of the recesses could have swallowed the Sanshara 500 times over. The largest could have docked the moon. And every berth was empty, and every approach was dark, and the ring made no sound on any band. And it hung above the gray moon in the full light of the lace-dimmed sun like the largest patient thing in the universe. It was Imel who said the other word, the one that set the tone for the worst 3 days of the voyage. Or a mausoleum, he said. Empty berths, dark approaches, parked at the door of their own homeworld. Maybe this is where the fleets came home to die, at the end. Maybe that's what you build when you know it's over. One last harbor, so that everything you ever sent out has a place to come back to, even after. He cleared his throat. We keep saying the system is full of lights. Has anyone confirmed one of those lights is biology? Heat is just heat. Machines make heat. We've met their machines all the way down the corridor, and their machines are courteous and tireless, and they keep the family grammar, and not one of them has a heartbeat. What if that's the answer nobody will say? The house is bright and warm and swept, and the family died 800 years ago, and the help never stopped working. The lace is growing, Lyran said. Machines grow things. The standing order at Cairn Deep renews annually. Machines renew things. Navigator, I want to be wrong. Give me one reading, one anywhere on this corridor that only a living people could produce, and I'll transmit my own apology system-wide. And Lyran, who had been awake for most of 3 days, looked at the ring on the scope and found she had no answer to give him, and the silence in the chart room was its own kind of black tile. That was the hour the power crisis stopped being arithmetic and became a countdown. Pellin came up from the pod gallery without knocking, which Pellin never did, and stood in the hatchway with the look of a physician who has rehearsed a sentence too many times to say it gently. Pod 17 dropped out of amber an hour ago, he said. Vera's pod. The support lattice is failing faster than the redundancies can pick it up. I have moved her to the head of the queue, and I am stealing power from systems we will want later, and none of it changes the shape of this. If she is not in a full revival suite inside of 6 days, the pod will finish failing with her inside it. 5 other sleepers are within 20 days of the same cliff. He looked at Dren, and then, because he was an honest man, he looked at Lyran. The ship cannot build what she needs. The ship could not build it with a year and a shipyard. We need a harbor, a real one. 6 days. Lyran went to the gallery and stood at pod 17 with her hand flat on the cold lid, the way she had stood every watch she could steal since waking, and looked at her mother's face through the frost. A face that had sung the corridor's welcome recordings to her before she could speak, and was now 6 days from never hearing them again. Her father stood his watch beside her and said nothing, because hull wardens do not say the things they hold. But his hand stayed on the back of her neck, graveside fashion, the whole hour. She did not remember deciding. She remembered standing in front of Dren and the assembled wake watch with her decision already made, the chart room hatch sealed, and the ring filling the forward port behind her like a pale horizon. Everything on this corridor answers compact protocol with compact courtesy, she said, and ignores compact hailing. The buoys won't talk, but they pulse a single watt of thanks. The station won't talk, but it fuels us and chimes us safe. The pattern isn't silence. The pattern is no voice. Every system we've met will act for us and will not speak to us. So we have been asking the wrong way. We keep transmitting hails, protocols, distress particulars, machine asking machine. I think the machines down here aren't allowed to answer machines. I think the voice is being saved. She brought up the file she had spent the night assembling. There is one transmission a corridor system could never mistake for protocol, the oldest one we own. The last thing this ship ever said to Earth. Dovin understood first. She watched it land in him, watched the Loremaster's eyes go bright and stricken at once. The departure manifest, he said. 800 years ago, this ship left HFY and beamed the compact's farewell to Earth, Liren said. Every name aboard, read aloud, both languages, signed with the registry song. It's in the archive, the original recording. Earth received it 30 years later. It is the last word Earth ever had from us. Whatever is alive or dead in this system, whatever keeps the buoys polished and the grammar current, if anything remembers the Senshara at all, it remembers that transmission. She paused, and her voice did the thing she could not stop it from doing, went young. And there's a line at the end of it. The manifest closed with an addendum, because the manifest was filed before launch, and I was born the day of it. My mother read the addendum into the record herself, from the natal bay, 11 hours out. I've heard it 1,000 times. So has every archive on this corridor if any of them still listen. Dren looked at her for a long moment. Say it, she said quietly. For the room. Liren said it the way her mother had said it. The old words in the old grammar. Senshara, outbound, all souls counted, and one soul over. A daughter born underway. We name her Liren. Earth, amend your registry. We are 39. Silence in the chart room. Then Dren said, Amel, strip the broadcast to the oldest compact carrier we have. Full archive fidelity, original recording, then the navigator speaks the addendum live, present tense, her own voice. If anything this system is keeping our name, we will knock with it. She turned to the port, to the vast pale patience of the ring. Aim it at the harbor. They transmitted at system noon, ship time on the 31st day since waking, 800 years and 4 months after the words had been spoken the first time. The original recording went out first, her mother's voice young and laughing at the edges, the registry song, the names of the dead read while they were still alive, Koro answering the roll. Then the carrier held open, and Liren leaned to the pickup and spoke across 8 centuries to whatever listened where Relay Selas used to be. Senshara returning. All souls counted, 6 souls mourned. The daughter born underway speaks for the ship. Earth, amend your registry. Her voice cracked and she led it. We are 32. I am Liren. We have come the long way home, and we are asking for harbor. For 4 seconds, nothing in the universe moved. Then the ring lit. It did not light the way machinery lights. No flood lamps, no strobes, no traffic ladders. A single thread of warm gold kindled on the inner face of the torus. At one berth, the smallest berth, a recess that the scope now resolved as cut to dimensions, Liren knew the way she knew her own hands, because they were the Senshara's dimensions. Her docking standard, her hull clearances, 800 years obsolete and machined into the face of a structure that had not existed when she launched. The gold thread traced the berth's outline, deliberate, unhurried, the way you light a lamp in a window, and then it ran outward along the ring's face and became a path, a corridor of light unrolling across 900 kilometers of pearl, pointing the way in. And then, on the oldest compact band, on the frequency of the original wayposts, breaking a silence 800 years deep, came static. Rough, warm, imperfect, alive static, the sound of an ancient transmitter being coaxed beyond its strength, and through it a voice. A human voice. It was a woman's voice, young, and it was shaking, and the accents was strange, and the grammar was the old grammar. Compact-era HFY, learned beautifully and spoken like a prayer half-remembered, and afterward not one member of the Wake Watch could describe hearing it without stopping to steady themselves. Because the first thing the voice did was answer the addendum. Rishidri amended, the voice said. 32 souls, and the daughter born underway speaks for the ship. A breath ragged, half a laugh and half something else entirely. Liren. Your birth has never been anyone else's. Forgive the silence. Forgive, there is so much to ask forgiveness for, and I have rehearsed this for 9 years and the words have all gone. Senshara, this is Earth. This is Earth, and you are awaited, and door is open. And oh, we are so glad you're late and not lost. Come in, please. Come in. In the chart room of the Senshara, 800 years from home in every direction, the crew of the longest voyage in 2 civilizations' history stood and listened to Earth weep over. An open channel, and nobody moved, and nobody breathed, and Dovin put his face in his hands. Liren keyed the pickup. Her training said to confirm approach vectors. 800 years of protocol said to request corridor particulars and harbor assignments. Earth, Senshara, she said. We have a sleeper in pod failure. My mother. We have 6 days. You have 6 hours, Earth said, and the grief in the voice burned off like fog. And underneath it was something Liren would learn in the days ahead was the truest face of what humanity had become while the Senshara slept. A competence so old and so deep it had stopped needing to raise its voice. Hold your course and dump your trim authority to us when you're ready. We'll fly you in. The harbor has had 800 years to get ready for exactly this. Medical is already moving. Liren daughter born underway. Look out your forward port. Liren looked. Space around the Sinshara was lighting up, not the ring, the sky. Point after point after point, in a sphere widening away from her ship in every direction, faint warm beacons kindling in a lattice across the whole vault of the dark, hundreds, then thousands, then too many to count, like a snowfall of lamps, like a city seen from altitude at dusk, and Liren understood, with a feeling that flooded up through her like the revival warmth had on waking, that she was seeing the silent system answer the role. Every light was a vessel, or a habitat, or a station, or a watching post. Every one of them had been listening on the old bands for 800 years of doctrine and discipline, and every one of them, released at last from the courtesy of silence, was turning toward one small ancient ship and lighting one small ancient lamp, the compact's harbor glow, the signal that meant in two languages at once. You are safe now, you are at rest, the watch is ours. They've been holding that in, the voice on the channel said softly, for a very long time. We all have. Welcome to Sol Senshura. Now come and let us catch you. The flight in took 5 hours, and the Senshara did not fly 1 minute of it herself. The moment Dren authorized the handover, the old ship was gathered up the way a tired swimmer is gathered by a strong current that has decided to be kind. Invisible traffic fields took her mass as gently as if 800 years of fatigue had been read from her hull and budgeted for, and the trim thrusters Liren had nursed across half a system were politely allowed to rest. Twice during the approach, escort shapes drew alongside, hulls of the same pearl and bone material as the ring, vast and silent and running no lights except on the flank of each, a single golden harbor glow, and on the second one, picked out in alloy inlay in formal Ashvaran script 3 meters tall, a name, kept for the 39. They named a ship for the manifest, Imel said, reading it over and over, for our manifest. He had not transmitted his system-wide apology yet. He would that night, exactly as he had promised, and the system would do him the courtesy of not answering, except for one fishing habitat somewhere off the second planet's rings that pulsed back a single watt of carrier wave, which by then the whole crew had learned to read as a smile. The berth received the Senshara like a hand receiving a bird. Cradle fields closed around the hull at the exact compact standard pressures written in Annex's 8 centuries dead. Umbilicals of unfamiliar make reached for ports of ancient design and made it on the first try, because somebody, sometime in the long dark, had manufactured adapters to a standard that existed nowhere else in the universe except on one lost ship. And through the chart room port, as the gold-lit walls of the recess rose around them, the crew saw the berth's interface for the first time and went quiet all at once. The walls were carved. Hundreds of meters of relief work in the pale material, panel after panel, climbing out of sight around the curve of the recess. The Senshara's own story, cut by hands or by something patient as hands. The departure from Ashvar with the registry song rendered as engraved notation. The crossing, the gate, the misfire, carved with terrible honesty, the ship breaking off its plotted line and falling away into a darkness the sculptor had textured so deep it swallowed the light. And then panel after panel of the same image, repeated with small differences decade over decade. The empty corridor, the silent wayposts, the watching figures, human figures, generations of them in changing dress, standing at the rail of this berth looking out into carved blackness at nothing, at an absence, at a ship that was not there. There were dozens of those panels. There was room left for hundreds more. The last finished panel showed the absence ending, a small ancient ship at the edge of the dark, returning. The carving of the Senshara herself was still raw, unweathered, its cuts bright. That panel, Sutha said unsteadily, is days old. They carved the homecoming while we were still inbound. No, Dovin said. He was looking down the long climbing spiral of panels, at the generations at the rail. They carved the homecoming 800 years ago. They've just been waiting to finish it. Then the airlock chimed, the old 3-tone harbor chime, and there was no more time for awe, because Pellin was at the inner hatch with Pod 17 on a transfer cradle, and his rehearsed sentences abandoned, shouting medical particulars into the lock before the seal had even opened. And the seal opened, and Liren saw human beings for the first time in her life. There were 6 of them, and they came through the lock fast, gowned for medicine, towing equipment that floated obediently at their heels, and they were not what the recordings had promised. Taller by a head and more, slower of expression, quicker of hand. Something in the proportion of them, in the unhurried economy of their movement, said plainly that these were not the loud young species of Dovin's stories, that 800 years had revised them as thoroughly as it had revised their sky. But the one in front had freckles across her nose, and the one in back was chewing something, and when the lead physician reached Pod 17, she put her bare palm flat on the frosted lid, exactly where Lyran's palm had worn the frost thin over 31 days, and said in compact-era Ashvaran with a strange and lovely accent, "Hello, Vera. Hold on, you are almost done waiting. They worked for 9 hours." The threshold, it turned out, had carried a full Ashvaran revival suite in stocked readiness for 6 centuries. Its consumables rotated and renewed on schedule by people who had no way to know if it would ever be used, its protocols drilled by relay teams of physicians, generation after generation, on simulators built from the compact's medical annexes. The freckled doctor, whose name was Seema, had trained on the Ashvaran sleeper systems for 11 years for this one night, in the lifelong professional certainty that the night would probably never come. When Lyran understood that, truly understood it, that there were humans walking the ring whose entire careers were a wager laid on the return of one lost ship, she had to leave the observation gallery and stand in the corridor for a while, breathing. Her father found her there. He had spent the 9 hours doing what wardens do, walking the new perimeter, learning the new doors. He stood beside her against the pearl wall, and for a while they watched the medical bay's light spill across the deck together. 600 years, he said at last, clumsily, because it was him. Dovin got it out of the speaker's people. The ring was finished 600 years ago. They computed our arc inside 2 centuries of the misfire, knew the window we'd come back in if we came back at all, and they built all this against the day. Then they crewed it and provisioned it and drilled it. He shook his head slowly. Lyran, your mother and I gave 800 years to the dark for this family without knowing it. But these people gave 600 on purpose. There has never been a courtship like it in the history of anything. At the 4th hour, Dren came to stand with them, and brought the question that the wonder had been holding down. They've told you how, she said to Dovin, who arrived trailing 2 of the Threshold's archivists, like a man being escorted by his own grandchildren. Has anyone told you why? The silence, Dovin. 31 days we hailed them down that corridor, thinking we were the last 2 voices of 2 dead worlds. The carved panels say they never stopped wanting us. The adapters say they never stopped expecting us. Then why in the deep dark did nobody ever answer? Because answering is dangerous, said a new voice, and waiting is not. The woman in the corridor mouth was young, younger than the doctors, dressed in a plain gray uniform whose only insignia was a single golden harbor glow at the collar, and Lyran knew the voice before the face. The voice from the channel, the one that had wept the registry amendment across the old band. In person, it carried the same thing underneath, the deep-keeled calm with grief and gladness riding on top of it. My name is Ada Marin, she said in the old grammar, with the old courtesy form of a host who comes to guests instead of summoning them. I hold an office called the Speaker of the Standing Welcome. I am the 24th person to hold it. The first was commissioned 609 years ago, when this harbor's keel was laid, and every speaker since has trained their whole life for a single duty, to be the voice on the channel when the Sinshara came home, and to answer for the silence when her crew asked. You have asked. She straightened, like a soldier delivering a report she had inherited from 23 predecessors. So, shipmistress, navigator, loremaster, all of you. The answer comes in 2 parts, and I would rather give it to you standing in front of what it cost. Will you walk with me? There is a room we built for this conversation 6 centuries ago, and you are the first people who will ever hear it used. The room was a long gallery on the ring's outer face, and one whole wall of it was transparent and earth hung in it. Lyran had seen the world in the archives 10,000 times. Nothing in the archives had prepared her for the original. A blue and white immensity wrapped in lace slight and garlanded with rings of habitats like strung pearls, the night side glittering not with the hard grids of the old recordings, but with soft continental rivers of gold, whole orbital districts wheeling past trailing gardens visible from this distance as a green haze, and beyond it, filling the black behind the planet at the edge of sight, the growing gossamer of the loom catching the sun. It was the single largest concentration of patient, organized living intention Lyran had ever seen or ever would, and it was completely silent on every band, and now she would learn why. Part 1, Ada Marin said, standing against her world like a woman introducing her family. Around 200 years after your misfire, our listening arrays crossed a threshold. We could hear everything, every band, every whisper, every direction, out to depths I am not permitted to bore you with. And we learned something that broke our hearts. The dark is full of cries. Lost ships, failing colonies, stasis arcs off course like yours by the hundreds of species we had never met, calling out on dying transmitters into a galaxy that mostly does not listen. And we learned that we ourselves were part of the deafness, because a civilization at our energies is loud. Navigator, our chatter, our traffic, our entertainments, swamped the very bands the lost cry out on. The arithmetic was simple and unbearable. Every year of our noise was some number of faint calls drowned, so we stopped. It took 3 generations, and it was the largest single act of public will in our history. We moved our voice into light, where it deafens no one, and we gave the old radio dark back to the lost. Every band your ship can transmit on is kept silent in this system, by law and by custom older than nations, for one reason, so that nothing that cries out there will ever go unheard because Earth was talking. She let that stand a moment. The wayposts were not switched off, Senshara. They were turned around. Every beacon on your corridor stopped being a mouth 600 years ago and became an ear. We did not fail to hear you. We heard you at the marker line, the first syllable of your first hail 31 days ago, and 100 million people have been following your approach ever since, and the silence you flew through was the sound of all of them refusing to shout over you. Then why not answer, Dren said, not as a challenge, like a woman setting the last weight on a scale. Part 2, Ada said, because of what you flew here in. Senshura, when your hail reached us, our joy nearly killed you. Understand what we are now. If this system had answered you the way it answers itself, the combined response would have hit your 800-year-old receivers like a hammer hits a wine glass. There are transmitters on this ring alone that would have cooked your comms bus from the inside at 100th power. We had nothing gentle enough, nothing slow enough, old enough, kind enough to your antique heart. The compact band transmitter I finally reached you on is 900 years old, the last of its kind, salvaged out of the Relay Celis Memorial Collection. The night your hail arrived, every museum conservator and signal archaeologist in near-Earth space converged on it, and they have not slept since. 31 days, Navigator. It took us 31 days of continuous work to restore one voice quiet enough to speak to you without breaking you. Her composure cracked, just once, the channel grief showing through. We listened to you call for us the whole way down. We heard the comms officer read the manifest into the dark. We heard you ask if we were dead. We were standing right here, all of us, with our hands over our mouths, so to speak, watching our archaeologists solder, begging them faster, faster. The children of the compact are at the door, and they think the house is empty. The carriers we could safely send, we sent. We cleared your road. We lit your buoy a single watt of thanks. We opened cairn deep and fueled you and chimed you safe. We spoke in deeds and held our voice, because the first law of the standing welcome, written by people who knew your customs better than I ever will, is this. The homecoming ship must never be harmed by the eagerness of the house. The gallery was silent, Earth turned in the wall, and there is a third part, Ada Marin said quietly, which is not an answer but a confession, and it is the part I have rehearsed since I was 9 years old and still cannot say without shaking. The silence and the slowness were ours to explain. The waiting was not ours alone. She touched the collar glow, and the long gallery wall opposite the window, which they had all taken for stone, lit from within like dawn coming up behind paper, and revealed itself to be not a wall but a ledger. You should know who else has been kept awake by your absence, before you decide what to think of us. Come and see what the galaxy did with 800 years while you slept. The lit wall was a roll of ships. Names, hull profiles, dates, all of it cut into the glowing material in stacked rows that ran the length of the gallery, and Liren walked the rows with her crew in a slow procession reading, and the understanding came over her in stages, the way sunrise comes over a valley. The first name was a human ark, lost in the early stellar age, recovered by the listening arrays 90 years after the Great Silence began. Haldane's Reckoning, 2 and 11 souls brought in. The second was human too. The third was not. The third was a name in a script Liren had never seen, annotated in Patient Ashfern and human characters both. A stasis ark of a species called the Rueli, drifting 4 centuries off a failed colonial run, heard crying on a band no one else monitored, reached, warmed, brought in, brought in. The phrase repeated down the wall like a heartbeat. A hive ship of the Vendek, generation lost, brought in. A trio of refugee hulls from a war the galaxy had forgotten the name of, brought in. A diplomatic packet ship of the Orsen, presumed mythical by its own descendants, found, thawed, brought in, its passengers delivered home to a world that had built statues of them. Row after row, 63 vessels, 9 species, 800 years of Earth sitting in its self-imposed quiet with the galaxy's largest ears and the galaxy's softest hands, hauling the lost out of the dark one ancient hull at a time, asking nothing, telling no one who did not ask. This is what the silence is for, Ada Marin said behind them. This is what it has always been for. We did not go quiet to mourn you, Senshara, or to hide from anything. We went quiet the way a rescue crew goes quiet at the mouth of a collapsed mine. The standing welcome was founded for you, Navigator. Yours is the birth we cut first and the manifest we learned by heart. But the doctrine your loss taught us, we spent on everyone. 63 crews are alive tonight on 11 worlds, because one Ashfern ship went missing 800 years ago and broke this system's heart. She said it without grandeur, an accountant closing a ledger. You ask the corridor a question all the way down. Is anyone alive in there? Here is the full answer. We are alive. We are more than you can presently imagine. And we have spent the whole of our adulthood as a species learning to be worth coming back to. Dovenry stood in front of the wall of the brought-in for a long time, and then he turned to Ada and bowed, the full old grammar bow, the one reserved for hosts whose hospitality has outrun the guest's ability to repay, and the 24th speaker of the standing welcome returned it without one degree of error. And that, Liren thought, was the moment the mourning of the Sinshara formally died. They had fallen down the corridor grieving a bright, loud young people gone silent, and the silence had turned in their hands, layer by layer, until it became the loudest thing the species had ever said. Her mother woke on the second morning. Liren was there, because Seema had promised her she could be. She stood at the head of the revival suite with her father's hand on her neck and watched the lid of Pod 17 open on harbor power in a room with 8 centuries of margin, and watched Veravath, signal keeper, take her first unassisted breath in 800 years and use it, before her eyes had even fully focused, to ask whether her family was on the board in gold. Gold, Liren said, and could manage nothing else. There was a long moment of recalibration while her mother looked at her. At the daughter she had put under at 20, who had crossed the system since waking, found a road through a transformed sky, knocked on the door of a transcended civilization with her own name, and brought the ship in. Something rearranged itself in Vera's face, pride displacing the last of the frost. You spoke the addendum, she said. It was not a question. She had known her daughter and her odds in the same glance. I amended the registry, Liren said. We're 32, and then the night caught up with her all at once. The black tiles and the silent corridor and the 6 days and the 1 watt of thanks and the navigator of the Censura, who had not cried at the wall of names or the carved berth or the voice on the channel, put her head down on her mother's shoulder and wept like the child who had left HFY, while her parents held on, and in the corridor outside, with great tact, an entire harbor pretended to be busy. The 6 who had not crossed were honored on the 5th day. The crew had wondered privately, awkwardly, what could be done. HFY and spacers are given to the dark with the registry song, but the Sinshara's dead had been 800 years in their pods, and the ship was grounded forever in a foreign harbor, and nobody had wanted to say any of that aloud. Ada Marin solved it by asking permission to show them a deck of the ring they had not seen. It was a grove. Real soil, real trees, earth trees, and impossibly, HFY and silver reeds grown tall from seed stock that turned out to have been preserved out of the old embassy gardens at Lowbank, all of it under a long skylight that held the blue and white of the turning world overhead. Down the grove's central walk stood a row of cut stone alcoves, niches in the pale harbor material, each one sized and oriented by compact funerary annex, each one empty. There were 39 of them. They were cut when the keel was laid, Ada said quietly. One for every name on the manifest, not as graves, you understand, as a promise that whatever happened out there, however the long dark used you, every soul of the 39 would have a place at the end of the road, and none of you would ever be sung in one voice. 600 years we have gardened around empty stone, hoping it would stay empty, or be filled by the very old after very long lives. 33 of them will stay empty a while yet. She stepped back. 6 are needed. The grove is yours, Sinshara. Whenever you are ready, the watch is ours. They sang the registry song that evening for Koro Eth and the 5 others, in 2 languages, because the harbor asked to learn its part and had, in fact, known its part for 6 centuries. 400 humans stood among the silver reeds and answered the Ashvaran descant with the human harmony. Line written into the compact's funerary annex by Dr. Ashapen's own delegation 800 years ago, note for note, unforgotten, and old Koro was laid into stone cut for him before Ada Marin's great-great-grandmother was born, under a skylight full of earth, with his student's hand flat on the warm rock. A navigator does not look away from a reading. Liren kept her eyes open the whole time. Afterward, walking back through the grove with the harbor's lamps coming up gold among the trees, Dren fell into step beside Ada Marin, ship mistress to speaker, and asked the question of office that was hers to ask. You have answered for the silence, Dren said, and the answer was better than anything 800 years of fear invented. Now answer for the rest of it, speaker, because my crew has noticed what you have not yet said. The birth fits us, the adapters fit us, the grammar, the grove, the funerary harmony, the revival suite, the doctors who spent careers on our medicine. You did not merely wait for this ship. You prepared for it the way a people prepares for a war or a wedding, every year for 6 centuries, against odds your own arithmetic must have called hopeless. I have commanded long enough to know what that kind of readiness costs. So tell me plainly, before I take one more step into your kindness, why? What does Earth want of the Sinshara? Ada walked a moment in silence as if confirming the question had truly been asked at last. There is a room I am charged to show you, she said. It was the first room finished, and it has been locked for 591 years, and what Earth wants is inside it. But I will say this much in the open air, because you have earned a plain answer and the room can be misread without it. Ship mistress, your ship carries something. It was logged on the original manifest in care of the signal keeper, Veravath. One sealed trust, hand to hand. Ashvar to Earth, under the Twin Shore Compact's final annex. The Sown Trust, the Life Library, Dren said slowly, are half of the exchange. Earth gave its own into Ashvar's keeping at the signing. The Sincharis was carrying the return gift when we went dark. Speaker, it's intact. I can hand it to you tonight, but you cannot tell me that is what 600 years of this was for. 8 centuries on, your people could build our life library from scratch. You could have synthesized everything in that vault before my crew finished waking. 400 years ago, Ada agreed. Conservatively, she stopped on the path and faced them, and the lamps caught the collar glow. And the year our science crossed that line, the question went to the whole of Earth openly, as such questions do now. The Sown Trust is within our reach to reconstruct, shall we? You can read the deliberations. They ran for a decade. They are taught to children. The answer that carried has 9 words, and it is carved over the door of the room I am taking you to. A small breath. The compact says hand to hand, we can wait. It was Lyran, walking just behind, who heard the shape under the words, the way she had heard the shape under the silence. The readings resolving again. One layer deeper than anyone had asked. You're not waiting to receive it, she said. Receiving takes an hour and a ceremony. Speaker, what is on Earth's side of the exchange? The compact was two-handed. Our trust for, and then she stopped, because the original annex assembled itself in her memory, clause by clause, in her mother's recorded voice, and the size of the thing arrived all at once. For yours, the exchange completes both ways or not at all. The compact doesn't close until Earth's countergift is given hand to hand, Ashvaran hands, and we never came. 800 years. You've been holding your half of a handshake for 800 years. 591 in its current form, Ada Marin said, with the ghost of the channel tremor back in her voice. It has been rewritten 23 times. Every speaker rewrites it once. The original aged, you see, and a gift must fit the hands that finally take it. Mine was finished 4 years ago. I had genuinely stopped believing I would be the one. She turned up the path, toward the ring's heart, toward a door 5 centuries locked. Come, Censura, come and close the compact. It has been open long enough. The room at the ring's heart was reached by a corridor that no one had walked except its keepers, and the keepers had walked it every day. The pale floor was worn in a smooth line down its center. 600 years of single-file footsteps, morning inspection and evening inspection, generation after generation, a path polished into stone by the feet of people checking that a promise was still where they had left it. Lyran walked the worn line and felt the hair stand up along her arms. Of everything the harbor had shown them, the wonders and the wall of names and the carved berth, it was the worn floor that finally made her understand what the standing welcome was. Not a monument, a chore, a daily, dutiful, unglamorous chore, done in the dark by people who would not live to see the point of it, and handed on. Over the door at the corridor's end, cut deep in both scripts, exactly as Ada had promised, ran the 9 words, the compact says hand to hand. We can wait. The speaker of the standing welcome did not open the door herself. She produced no key and gave no order. She stood aside and gestured, and the wake watch of the Sinchara learned that the lock had been listening for one thing for 591 years. Because Dovin Ree, lore master, last living soul to have stood in the Lowbank embassy, stepped forward and spoke the compact's claiming formula in the old grammar, the words any treaty officer of either species would have spoken at any joint vault in the old days. Words that were nothing special at all, except that no Ashvaran voice had said them aloud in this system for 8 centuries. By 2 shores and 1 accord, the parties stand at the door. The lock answered in 2 voices, a human voice and an Ashvaran voice recorded, Lyran learned later, in the year the room was sealed. Both speakers 800 years dead. The parties are awaited. Enter in peace. The door swung on hinges that did not even whisper, and they entered the room Earth had kept. It was small. After the 900-kilometer ring and the gallery with a planet in the wall, the room at the heart of everything was scarcely larger than the Sinchara's own wardroom, stone-floored, warm-lit and plain, and Lyran grasped at once that the plainness was the point. This was a room from the old days, proportioned and furnished by compact annex like the embassy parley rooms at Lowbank, a piece of the world the Sinchara had left, preserved at the center of the world that had replaced it, so that whatever walked in after however many years would find one room that still fit them. Down its center ran a table of dark earth wood. On one side of the table stood a single chair of human make. On the other stood the Ashvaran standing rest, correctly built, correctly angled, 800 years out of production. And on the table lay the gift, and the gift was a book and a key, and behind them, in shelves cut into the end wall, stood 23 other books, withdrawn but kept, spines out, each stamped with the seal of the speaker who had written it. Every generation rewrote it, Ada Marin said from the doorway. She had not entered. Would not, Liren realized, until the exchange was made and the parties were equal. The first draft was a star atlas and a treaty amendment. The second was mostly apologies. The sixth was written during our worst century and is 200 pages of engineering we thought you would need to survive us. I am glad you never read it. The 14th speaker was a poet, and hers is the one we all wept over in training, and it would have been entirely useless to you. Each one was the best answer its age could give to the same question. When they finally come, what do we owe them? She nodded at the table. Mine is the 24th. It is the shortest. After 600 years, we finally understood that the answer was never going to be a document. Dren looked at the book, and at the key beside it, a plain, heavy thing of pearl and bone alloy on a worn cord. Speaker, she said, before any hand touches anything, the trust completes both ways or not at all, ours first. So it was done in the old order in the plain room, with the harbor's recording witnesses standing where the annex said witnesses stand. Veravath, signal keeper of the Sinshara, keeper of the Sound Trust through 800 years of dark, carried the sealed case from the ship through corridors lined with humans who had come from 3 worlds away to stand silently along the route, and set it on the dark wood table, and spoke the words of giving with her daughter at her shoulder. Ada Marin's hands received Ashvar's life library, every species of a world, seed and song and sequence, the return gift promised at the signing of the Twin Shore Compact, 800 years late and intact to the last grain. The speaker held the case the way Seema had held Pod 17, and her voice when she finally found it was not the channel voice or the office voice, but only a young woman's voice, saying the formula of acceptance with 23 dead speakers crowded into it. The trust is taken, the shore is reached. Let both worlds witness. Nothing that was given was lost. Then she turned the table. Earth's countergift slid across the dark wood, the slim book and the heavy key, into the hands of the crew of the Sinshara, and Ada Marin stepped across the threshold at last, the exchange made, the parties equal, and explained what they were holding, and the plain room got very quiet. The book held charts. The crew bent over them, and at first Liren read them as star charts of the old kind, and then the notation resolved and her breath went thin. Routes. Fold routes, but not the old kind, not the desperate single-throw gamble that had broken the Sinshara. Stabilized, anchored, permanent corridors, drawn between Sol and a webwork of stars, dozens of them, with transit times marked in days. The compact era had dreamed of such a thing in the joint annexes, sketched its mathematics, named it with the plain, hopeful arrogance of that age, the bridge. It had been the two species' great shared ambition. The project, the Sinshara's own mission, had been a thread of, and Earth had gone on alone in the long silence and built it, anchor by anchor, across 800 years. And on the central chart, drawn in gold, one route ran off the edge of all the others, far past the webwork's frontier, a single long deliberate reach across the dark, terminating at a star whose Ashvaran name was written beside the human one in careful compact era, script, home. The route ran to Ashvar, anchor by anchor, Ada Marin said. It was begun 300 years ago when the bridge technique matured. The far anchor station entered Ashvar's outer system 2 centuries back, ran dark, and parked. It has held station there ever since, complete, tested, ready. Transit time from this ring to Ashvar's threshold is 19 days. She let them stare at the gold line, at the impossible arithmetic of it. 80 years collapsed into 19 days, the gulf that had eaten their whole lives reduced to a ferry run, and it has never been used, not once. No probe, no signal, no visit. The Ashvar door was finished 600 years after your people last saw us, and 200 years before tonight, and it is locked, and Earth built the lock as carefully as it built the door. She nodded at the heavy pearl key in Liren's hands. That is the only one. You built a road to our home, Sutha said slowly, and never knocked. 200 years you could have crossed in 19 days, met them, told them, she faltered. Told them about us. Why? Because we were not invited, Ada said simply. Think of what the crossing would have meant. Engineer. Earth as you found it, arriving uninvited at the threshold of the world you left. A power that weaves its star into baskets, knocking on the door of a people who last knew it as a loud young culture with 4 hulls a year and borrowed grammar. However gently we came, we would have arrived as a verdict. Ashvar never asked us to come. Ashvar grieved you, the way we grieved you, and built what it built, and became what it became, and it has the right to meet the new Earth on its own terms or not at all. The compact gave us no claim on your world's door, only on yours. She looked around the plain room, at the crew of the Sinshara, and delivered the heart of 600 years as evenly as a docking clearance. The law of the door was written when its first anchor was laid, and it has one clause. The Ashvar door opens to Ashvaran hands at an Ashvaran word, in Ashvaran time, or never. We built the road because love builds roads. We locked it because love does not walk in uninvited. And then we waited for the only people in the universe with the standing to turn that key. And you were 800 years late. And we are very, very glad you came. The crew of the Senshara stood in the warm plane room with the key to their own homecoming heavy in the navigator's hands and the gold line burning on the chart. And for a long moment nobody could speak, because there are sizes of gift that have no etiquette. It was Dovin, finally, who broke, and he broke laughing. The same helpless old man laugh from the scope, grief and awe with the proportions reversed now, and he had to lean on the dark wood table while it shook out of him. "Forgive me," he managed. "Forgive me, Speaker. It's only we came down your corridor composing eulogies. We stood in your fuel bunkers and pitied you. Imel mourned you over hot rations. Beautifully, you should have heard him. 800 years we slept, certain to our bones that we were the last loyal fragment of a finished story, the poor doomed witnesses, the ones who remembered. And the whole time the story had simply, he gestured helplessly at the room, the ring, the world, and the walls, the gold line to Ashvar, outgrown the page. We are not the mourners' children. We never were. We are the prodigal grandparents. And the house we left grew up and kept every one of our customs better than we kept them, and built a road home for us, and had the unbearable good manners not to use it." He wiped his eyes and straightened and looked at Liren and at the key. "Navigator, I believe the next reading is yours." But Liren was looking at Ada Marin, because the last layer had just resolved the way they all eventually did. 19 days, she said. "The far anchor has sat dark in Ashvar's outer system for 200 years. Speaker, my world watched the gate misfire. They received the fault flash 30 years after we broke. They have known for most of 8 centuries that the Sinshara fell into the long dark, and they never knew the arc closed, because Earth itself barely caught it. Ashvar thinks we died, the way we thought Earth died." Her hand closed around the key. "There are 39 names on a manifest that 2 worlds have been grieving from opposite ends of the same road. When that door opens, the first thing through it has to be the registry song. They have to hear the amendment before they hear anything else, before they see your sky or your lace or your harbor. Earth waited 600 years to be invited. Ashvar has waited 800 to be told." She lifted the key and lifted her chin, and the daughter born underway gave the standing welcome its last order of the long watch, as if she had been born to that too. "We accept the gift. We invite you. And we open it now, tonight, because somewhere on the other end of that gold line is a registry with our names in black, and no one should grieve 1 hour longer than the road requires." Ada Marin, 24th Speaker of an office built to hear exactly those words, bowed her head. "The welcome stands ready," she said. "Sinshara, take us home with you." Tonight, it turned out, was a word that even Earth's competence could not entirely honor. The opening of a road between worlds takes preparation, no matter how long the road has stood finished. The harbor asked for 12 days to muster the crossing, and gave the crew of the Sinshara, in exchange, the one thing none of them had let themselves ask for, the world itself. They went down on the 8th morning in a harbor shuttle that fell through the bright side of the planet, and Liren Vath, born underway between 2 worlds and citizen of neither, stood at the viewport and watched Earth come up at her in layers of cloud and light, and discovered that no archive, no recording, no 800 years of her mother's bedtime descriptions had prepared her for the simple violence of a horizon. She'd lived her whole life inside hulls. The first thing Earth did to her was refuse to end. They landed at Lowbank. It was Dovin they all watched, stepping down onto the soil of the estuary town where he had been a young clerk 8 centuries ago. The whole crew braced for it to break him, and Ada Marin, walking beside him, watched with the particular care of a woman who had read his personnel file from the compact archives and rehearsed this hour too. But Lowbank did not break him, because Lowbank had refused to become a relic. The town had grown old the way the buoys had, tended current, alive. The embassy district still stood, not sealed under crystal but worked in, its parley halls hosting the harbor administration's southern offices. Its long stone quays crowded with mooring craft and market stalls and children, its street names unchanged, its 2-script signage maintained by a town ordinance 8 centuries old that nobody had ever bothered to repeal. The tavern where a human woman had out-argued him on Ashvaran etiquette was still a tavern. It had a plaque, because the argument had become locally famous, and the plaque, he was outraged and delighted to discover, said the woman won. "It does not feel like returning to a grave," he said that evening, sitting on the quay wall with the tide coming up the estuary, "and it does not feel like returning home either. It feels the lore master for once hunted for a word." It feels like meeting the grandchild of a friend and finding the friend's laugh in them. Nothing is mine anymore. Everything is theirs. And they kept the laugh. In the center of the old embassy quarter, in a courtyard where two species had once signed a compact, the witness elm still stood. It had been a sapling in the signing year recordings, planted by Dr. Asha Penn and the Ashvarn first delegate together, one ceremonial spadeful of soil from each shore mixed at its roots. 800 years had made it a giant, broad as a watchtower, its crown roaring softly over the courtyard like a green sea, and into its bark, at the height of a standing rest, generations of hands had pressed small tokens of pearl and bone alloy until the trunk's lower reach glittered. The harbor glow mark, thousands upon thousands of them, one pressed into the wood, the town clerk explained. For every year of the Standing Welcomes Watch, in a small civic ceremony held each year on the anniversary of the Sanshara's departure. 8 centuries of small, bright patience, climbing the tree out of reach. Liren stood under the elm for a long time with her parents, the three of them leaning together in the crowd noise of a living town, and let the size of it settle through her. They never knew us, she said finally. That's the part I can't hold. Everyone who actually knew anyone aboard was dust 700 years ago. This town has pressed metal into a tree for 800 years for strangers. The doctors learned our blood for strangers. The speaker learned our grammar, our funerals, our courtesy forms. Her whole life poured out for people she had no reason to believe were even alive. Mother, I keep looking for the trick of it. Nobody grieves for strangers for 8 centuries. No, Vera said, nobody does. The signal keeper of the Sanshara watched the elm's crown moving against the lace-veined sky. Which means that somewhere in those 8 centuries, we stopped being strangers and became a story. And stories don't obey the arithmetic of grief, little navigator. They get handed down, they gather. A grandmother tells a child about the lost ship, and the child grows up owning the loss without ever owning the loved one, and tells it again. 800 years of that and the missing of us became part of what these people are. We are woven into them, Liren, not as guests. As a wound they decided never to let close, because keeping it open kept the door open. She was quiet a moment. We did the same, you know, on the other shore. Ashvar will be full of our story too. That is what should frighten you about the door, if anything does. And there it was, spoken at last under the elm. The fear that had been growing quietly in all of them since the gold line on the chart, the mirror of the grief they had carried down the corridor. 800 years had transformed Earth past every recording. The same 800 years had been at work on Ashvar. The world they remembered, the world Liren had been told instead of shown, the departure rings and the silver reed coasts and the grammar that Earth had preserved like a treasure, all of it was 8 centuries gone on the far shore too. The crew of the Sanshara had spent 31 days learning that they were not the mourners of a dead Earth. They had not yet had time to learn what they actually were, which was a ship full of ancestors. Whatever waded through the Ashvar door would know them, if it knew them at all, the way Lowbank knew Dovin, as a story, as names on a memorial, as the wound in the family that never closed. Her father said it plainest, on the last night on the surface, in the blunt warden's voice that only ever surfaced what everyone already carried. We woke up grieving a world that had outlived us, Arlvath said. In 12 days we find out if our own world did the same. There's no version of that door opening where we get back what we left. There's only finding out what 800 years built out of missing us. It built something worth meeting here. I choose to believe it built something worth meeting there. He looked at his daughter. Either way, the first voice through that door speaks for every soul on the manifest, living and dead. Dren's posted the watch order. It's you. The mustering of the crossing convoy was the largest formal act Earth had performed in a century, and Earth performed it with the unbearable restraint the crew had come to know as the species' adult voice. No armada. The law of the door said Ashvaran hands, Ashvaran word, Ashvaran time, and Earth held to its own law at the hour of payoff as exactly as it had held. Through 600 years of waiting, the convoy would be 3 ships, first the Sanshara herself. Liren had assumed her ship's part and this was over. The Sanshara was 800 years obsolete, full dead, her keel reactor finished, a museum piece docked forever in the berth carved with her story. The harbor's yards asked Dren's permission to make her sound, and what came back out of the gold-lit recess 11 days later moved Sutha Orm to walk. Every meter of her hull with her hand pressed flat against the plating. They had not modernized her, they had restored her, with a fanatic compact-era exactness, to the ship the departure recordings showed, and then, deep in her bones where the eye would never offend, they had quietly made her immortal. A new keel heart of harbor pearl, trim authority she would never again exhaust, a stasis gallery rebuilt so that no tile would ever again go black for want of margin. The Sanshara would cross her own gold line under her own name and her own silhouette. The ship that left, the ship coming home, and she would be carrying, At Vera's suggestion and to the harbor archivist's undisguised joy, the original recording of the registry song to be transmitted through the door before any living word. Second would come the speaker's ship, kept for the 39, carrying Ada Marin, the 24th draft of the countergift, the Sohn Trust's formal documentation, and a crew of 200 volunteers winnowed from, the roll said, 31 million applicants. Earth had chosen its first faces for the far shore with the care of a species that understood it would be a verdict no matter how gently it arrived, and had settled after public deliberation on a crew whose median age was 26. We will send them our young. The deliberation's closing argument ran, so that HFY may meet us at the beginning of something rather than the end. Third last, and smallest would come a hull with no crew at all, an anchor tender to wake the far station, open the route's permanent moorings, and then do the thing for which the whole convoy's order of sailing had been designed. The moment the door stood open stable, the tender would seed the far anchor with the bridge's full route mathematics, the engineering corpus, the keys to every anchor technique Earth possessed, ownership transferring on delivery, unconditional, irrevocable. The road home would not be a human road that HFY's ships were licensed to use. It would be HFY's road both directions, forever, to open or close or extend as HFY alone saw fit. The compact says hand-to-hand, Ada Marin said when Dren raised an eyebrow at the manifest. It does not say which hands keep the road. Shipmistress, my office has had 600 years to think about what went wrong the first time. The first compact built one corridor and two worlds took turns being far away. This time nobody waits 80 years for anybody. This time, when a ship goes dark, the road itself goes looking. On the morning of the 12th day, the convoy stood off the threshold's great axis in the order of sailing, and the HFY door was brought up to readiness for the first time in 200 years. Liren had expected the door to be a gate, some monumental architecture of rings and fire. It was nothing of the kind. It was a region of empty space off the threshold's rim, marked by a modest collar of anchor buoys, indistinguishable from any other piece of dark. The bridge's mouths, Sutha had learned with professional indignation, were mathematics, not monuments. All the architecture the moment would ever have was the harbor itself behind them, lit end to end with a golden glow, every berth and gallery and grove deck skylight crowded, and Earth beyond it, and the lace beyond that, and ahead, marked by a thin gold ring on the navigation displays and by nothing at all in the universe, the closed mouth of a road 800 years in the keeping. In the restored chart room of the Sinshara, at her own station, with the pearl key seated in a lock the harbor had machined into her console 11 days ago, Liren Vath ran her pre-transit checks the way Koro Eth had taught her. Every reading confirmed twice, and found her hands were steady after all. Dren's voice came quiet over the ship's address, all stations, all souls. 800 years ago, this ship sailed with 39 names and a promise. The promise is kept, the manifest is amended, and the road is paid for. Navigator. A breath's pause, and the shipmistress of the Sinshara permitted herself, once in 8 centuries, a tone that was not command. Take us home. Liren turned the key. There was no thunder. The bridge's mouth opened the way the harbor did everything, with a terrible gentle competence. The gold ring on the displays brightened, the empty dark ahead of the Sinshara folded its emptiness aside, and a corridor of structured space took the old ship's keel like a current taking a boat off a beach, and the convoy of 3 slid out of Saul with the whole golden harbor blazing behind them and 800 years of waiting paid. Forward into 19 days. The crossing itself was almost insultingly calm. The bridge ran smooth as poured metal. There was nothing for a navigator to do except verify the anchor's handoffs and try to sleep. Liren spent the days learning the convoy and the nights at the chart room port, watching structured darkness flow past at speeds that made the misfire's whole 800-year catastrophe look like a stumble on a doorstep. And on the 9th night, Ada Marin crossed over from kept for the 39 and stood the late watch with her, 2 people whose offices had been pointed at each other across 6 centuries, drinking the Sinshara's terrible voyage tea. I keep thinking about your 23 predecessors, Liren said. Whole lives spent rehearsing a single conversation they never got to have. If the ark had scattered us a little wider, you'd have been the 24th name on that shelf, and some child not born yet would be sitting here instead. Doesn't it grieve you, speaker? All those lives spent on an if. Ada considered it, turning her cup. The 4th speaker wrote something about that, she said. It's in the part of the training every child of the welcome learns first. She wrote, we do not keep the watch because the ship will come. We keep the watch because the keeping is what we want our species to be made of. If the Sinshara comes, the watch will have been worth it. If the Sinshara never comes, the watch will have been worth it. There is no version of the keeping that is wasted, because the keeping is the gift we give ourselves. The lost are only the occasion. She looked out at the flowing dark. 800 years ago, by every account we have, we were a species that broke things, promises among them. Worlds, nearly, our own first of all. Then we met your people and signed our first promise to a stranger, and then the dark took you. And the promise had no one left to be kept to. Do you understand, Navigator? You were the promise we could not break even when every reason for keeping it was gone. Learning to keep it anyway is how we became whatever it is we are now. The standing welcome isn't something Earth does. It is, as near as I can say it in your grammar, the thing Earth practices on. You were never an if to us, Lyran. You were the discipline. On the 19th day, the bridge set them down in the cold outer dark of a system Lyran had never seen and knew by heart, and the far anchor station, 200 years on station and dark, woke at the convoy's touch and lit, for the first time, its single golden harbor glow. Ahead, far down the well, a small warm star burned in a lacework of its own. Not Earth's lace, nothing like it. As the long-range optics drank and resolved, Sutha began to laugh and cry at once at her station, because the structures wrapping the inner system of HFY were grown, not woven, vast orbital reefs of engineered silver-reed coral, living habitats cultured across centuries, green gold and breathing, a civilization that had taken the other road to the same altitude. Two worlds had each spent 800 years becoming unrecognizable, and had arrived, by utterly different doors, at the same room. Power grown so great and so patient it had stopped needing to be loud. But HFY was not silent. The convoy heard it the moment the anchor's receivers opened. The whole system was singing. On the old bands, the compact bands, the corridor bands, from 1,000 sources endlessly overlapping, a structured, ceaseless, deliberate transmission saturating every approach to the star, and Imel Sa, who had spent 31 days hailing a silent system, had the headphones pressed to his skull and tears running freely down his face, because he had recognized it before the computers did. It was the registry song, their registry song. The Senshara's own departure roll, all 39 names, transmitted in rotation with the rolls of every other ship HFY had ever lost, on every band the Dark had ever taken anyone from, repeating, 800 years and never once stopped. A lighthouse of names, blazing into the void on the infinitesimal chance that somewhere out in the deep dark, something with HFY ears was still alive to steer by it. They never went quiet, Imel said, broken open. Earth held its breath so the lost could be heard. HFY never stopped calling so the lost could find the way. 800 years, both shores, the same grief, and they both turned it into a lamp. We fell down the one stretch of dark in the universe where neither lamp could reach. And the whole time, both ends of the road were burning. Send it, Dren said quietly. Send ours. So the answer HFY had been transmitting into the dark for 8 centuries came back to it at last, from the cold rim of its own system, in the original recording. Veravath's voice, young and laughing at the edges, the roll of the 39, Koro answering, and then Liv, in the old grammar, the amendment, spoken by the daughter born underway, whose name was the last word her world had ever had from the ship. Senshara, returning. All souls counted, 6 souls honored, 32 ascending. The registry is amended. HFY and Lyran's voice held, because a navigator does not look away from a reading, even when the reading is her own heart breaking open. HFY, this is Lyran. We found the way home by your lamp and the other shore's silence. We are 19 days out, we are escorted by friends, and we are asking for harbor. What came back, 90 light minutes later, was not protocol either. It began as a single voice, a traffic warden somewhere over HFY who audibly forgot every procedure ever written, answering in the new grammar with the old formula crashing through it. Harbor granted, all roads, all moons, every door of every house. Then the voice multiplied. The convoy fell sunward through a system waking up around it world by world, the orbital reefs lighting their spires, the moon yards ringing their hulls like bells, and on the old corridor bands, 2 civilizations worth of grief converting itself in real time into the loudest welcome ever recorded. The lighthouse roll call dissolving, name by name, as each name was struck from the litany of the lost, until at the end the great transmission that had run unbroken for 800 years fell, for the first time, wholly silent, and then took up a different song entirely. And Dovin Ree, hearing it, had to be helped to a chair. The homecoming descant, the one written into the compact's annexes for the return of treaty ships, which had never once, in all the time since its writing, been needed. HFY had changed past all recognition, and HFY had kept everything. The crew descended into a world of grown towers and tended coasts where their faces were already known, reconstructed from departure archives and carried all this time the way Lowbank carried its Elm tokens. The Senshara's 39 were the central names of the House of the Long Light, the vigil institution that tended the lighthouse roll, staffed for 8 centuries by, among others, an unbroken line of volunteers from the descendants of the crew's own kin. Lyran stood in the house's stone hall, before the wall where her name had been carved the year of her birth in the column of the lost, and watched a mason of the house, with 800 years of ceremony behind every stroke, cut the amendment beside it, returned her father's name, her mother's, Coro's with the honor mark of the grove on the far shore. 32 returned, 6 honored the registry whole. And then the mason stood aside, and the keeper of the house of the long light, a stooped and ancient ashvarn with the lighthouse roll's first verse tattooed down both arms, turned to the humans standing quietly at the back of the hall, Ada Marin and her crew of the young, who had waited at the threshold and entered only when invited, in Ashvarn time, at an Ashvarn word, and bowed the full bow of hosts whose hospitality has been outrun. 800 years we sang to the dark, the keeper said, and the dark sent back our children, escorted, healed, restored down to the grain of their hull, with their dead honored and their road paid for, and the keys to the road itself laid in our hands unasked. The House of the Long Light has kept the longest vigil in our history, and we find tonight that on the far shore of it, strangers were keeping it with us in their own way the whole time and never said a word. The old eyes found Ada, speaker of the standing welcome. Our worlds signed a compact once, when both were young. 2 shores, 1 accord. We are old now, both of us, and the treaty's every clause is discharged, and the trust is exchanged, and the law is satisfied. So nothing that happens next belongs to law. Tell your Earth. Ashvar invites it, not as a signatory, as family. The door stays open. The door stays open, Ada Marin answered, in flawless old grammar, with 23 lifetimes behind it, for as long as anything keeps it, and something will always keep it. The first year of the open road wrote itself into both worlds' histories faster than the historians could keep up. The crossings became monthly, then weekly. The House of the Long Light and the Standing Welcome federated their watches and turned 2 memorial institutions into 1 living harbor authority spanning the Gold Line. The bridge's mathematics, Ashvar's now, sprouted survey missions toward 3 more silent stars where lighthouse rolls were still being sung by other species over other lost ships. Because the galaxy was full of cries, and now 2 worlds were listening together, and the wall of the Broaden had stopped being a human ledger and become a joint one. Sutha Orm took a chair at the joint yards, teaching compact-era engineering to Harbor Pearl artisans who treated her like a living manuscript. Imelsau ran the first relay station at the bridge's midpoint, where the silence was kept and the lamps were lit, both customs, both shores. Dovin Ree went home to Lowbank, to the tavern with the plaque, and began at last writing it all down. Her parents took land within sight of the House of the Long Light, on a silver-reed coast her mother had described to her through a pod lid 800 years ago, and the description, Liren found when she finally stood on it, had been exactly right. It was the one thing in 2 systems the centuries had not changed at all. And the Sinshara flew. She was the only ship in either civilization licensed to wear the old corridor designation, and she flew the Gold Line in permanent commission as the road's own keeper. The welcome ship, first hull through to every new crossing, carrier of the registry songs, bearer of the worn pearl key that no lock would ever need again, and that her navigator wore on its cord anyway. The standing welcome had offered Liren the 25th speakership, and the House of the Long Light had offered her the keeper's succession, and she had declined them both with the full old grammar bow, because somewhere in the crossing she had finally taken the reading on her own position, and the fix was clean. She was the daughter born underway. She had never in her life arrived anywhere, and it had taken 2 transformed worlds and 800 years to teach her that this was not her tragedy. It was her office. Some people are the shore, some people are the road. On the first anniversary of the homecoming, the Sinshara stood the midnight watch alone at the bridge's midpoint, halfway between 2 lamps, and Liren Vath sat in her chart room writing up the day's log in a ship that hummed with new keel and old bones. Under the framed first page of the log, Koro Eth had started the day she was certified, 19 years old, 2 navigators. The young one has better instincts. She wrote the position, the readings, the traffic. 4 crossings westbound, 3 east, 1 Vendek pilgrim convoy escorted to the reefs, all souls counted, all roads quiet. Then, because the log was hers and the watch was long, she turned back, as she sometimes did, to the entry from the 31st night of the long fall, the one written by a girl who believed she was the last mourner of 2 dead worlds, and read the old line once more. Everyone who ever waited for this ship is dead. We are coming home to people who have never heard our names. She had never struck the line. A navigator does not erase a reading. She corrects it, dates the correction, and signs. Liren took up the stylus, and beneath the oldest grief in her log she wrote the amendment the whole long dark had been waiting for, and signed it, and went back up to the watch. Reading in error. The instruments were grieving. Observed fact, both shores, 800 years confirming, no one who is loved is ever coming home to strangers. The names were kept. The lamps were kept, the registry stands as mended, we were never lost, we were expected.